San Diego Border Patrol agents found what they are calling a highly sophisticated cross-border drug smuggling tunnel.
When the Trump administration declared that the president's threat to shut down the border with Mexico was no bluff and then followed through with an unprecedented, sweeping closure of one of the busiest international boundaries on Earth, the consequences reverberated with the force of an earthquake that shook both nations simultaneously, sending shock waves through every layer of society, economy, and governance. Because what had long been considered unthinkable, the halting of $1 billion, 8-day artery of commerce, culture, and daily life, was suddenly real, immediate, and suffocating. And while past episodes of border disruption had occurred in piecemeal fashion, involving specific checkpoints or temporary slowdowns, this was a rupture of an entirely different magnitude, a shutdown that transformed bustling crossings into ghostly expanses of barricades and armed personnel, that froze traffic into endless serpentine lines stretching for miles, that left trucks loaded with perishable produce rotting under the desert sun and car assembly plants paralyzed for lack of Mexican-made parts, that silenced the humming engines of daily commuters, shoppers, and students who had long blurred the line between two nations through their lived routines, and the sheer scale of the disruption carried a message that could not be mistaken. Something extraordinary had occurred, something so severe and so terrifying in its immediacy that federal authorities believed no half measure, no partial restriction, could suffice. And in the vacuum of official explanations, speculation flourished like wildfire, with some voices claiming it was a massive armed confrontation at the border, others insisting it was a coordinated cartel push designed to overwhelm defenses, still others whispering of a discovered plot so sinister that authorities had no choice but to act with absolute finality. And though the details remained locked behind government silence, what was visible to the public was a militarized spectacle, as armed personnel deployed in unprecedented numbers, as drones and surveillance towers stitched an unblinking electronic net across the frontier, as helicopters and air patrols circled above, as highways leading to crossing points became clogged with checkpoints that spread fear far inland, in the sudden absence of the border's daily rhythm, of trucks hauling freight, of workers crossing for jobs, of families reuniting, created not just logistical inconvenience but a haunting stillness, as if the heartbeat of the region had been stopped by force. And this stillness carried implications that went far beyond traffic jams or spoiled shipments, for in that silence communities confronted the raw truth that their lives were built upon a system so delicate that it could be suspended in an instant, and while economic analysts scrambled to calculate the billions evaporating by the hour, while businesses collapsed under the weight of supply chain fractures, while agricultural goods withered and assembly lines froze, ordinary people bore the human cost most directly, as parents struggled to explain to their children why they could not cross for school, as patients feared for their lives without access to doctors across the line, as families were severed by a barrier that had always existed but rarely felt so absolute, and the psychological weight of that severance was immense. A reminder that the border was not only a place of connection, but also a line of separation that could at any moment reassert its harsh dividing power. And politically, the consequences exploded into both nations' capitals, wherein Washington officials framed the shutdown as proof that border threats were real, immediate, and capable of endangering the nation at its core, pointing to the incident as justification for stricter enforcement and greater fortifications. While critics countered that shutting down the entire border over a single event was reckless, destabilizing, and corrosive to international trust. And in Mexico City, leaders faced their own firestorm, accused of allowing conditions that had unleashed such a crisis, while also pointing out the unilateral nature of Washington's decision, which had plunged Mexican border cities like Tijuana, Ciudad Juarez, and Matamoros into chaos overnight, leaving local economies in ruins and governments scrambling to maintain order. And beneath the rhetoric lay the inescapable fact of asymmetry. One decision made in Washington could cripple entire regions of northern Mexico, laying bare the imbalance of power that had always haunted the relationship. And yet the consequences were not merely economic or political but existential, because border communities had long cultivated a shared hybrid identity, a cultural and social ecosystem where life flowed across the line as naturally as water. And with the closure, that identity was fractured, the invisible bridges that connected El Paso to Ciudad Juarez, San Diego to Tijuana, Brownsville to Matamoros suddenly torn away, leaving people adrift, feeling not like members of a dual community but as citizens trapped on opposite sides of a wall. And the psychological toll of that rupture cut deeper than any spreadsheet of economic loss could measure, because it reminded millions that their daily lives depended on a fragile system of permeability that could vanish without warning. And the crisis exposed not only the vulnerability of trade and travel but also the fragility of interagency coordination, as customs and border protection, state police, federal investigators, and military units were forced into a rushed improvisational dance of intelligence sharing, joint command centers, and emergency deployments, revealing long-standing gaps in communication, logistical mismatches, and failures of strategy that analysts later admitted had been papered over in calmer times but were brutally exposed under stress. And in this way, the shutdown became not merely a reaction to an incident but a test, a mirror reflecting how prepared or unprepared two nations truly were to handle crises that struck at their shared artery of life. And in the broader theater of global perception, the closure sent tremors outward, reminding international observers that the United States, when pushed by fear or crisis, would not hesitate to shut down a vital lifeline of commerce even at staggering cost, raising questions in capitals from Ottawa to Beijing about the reliability of global supply chains and the predictability of U.S. responses in times of security emergencies. And so what began as a terrifying incident at a single crossing point cascaded into an economic, political, cultural, and psychological earthquake whose aftershocks would reverberate long after the barricades were lifted, leaving behind not only fractured businesses and disrupted families but also a lingering awareness that the border, so often taken for granted as both barrier and bridge, was in fact a fragile, volatile seam whose rupture could shake nations, unsettle identities, and remind millions that the lifeline they depend on is at once indispensable and profoundly vulnerable. Conversely, many U.S. residents who had long depended on the affordability of medication, dental care, and other vital health services across the line suddenly found themselves cut off without warning. And what for years had been a routine crossing to pick up prescriptions, attend a dentist appointment, or access clinics that offered quality care at a fraction of the U.S. cost was instantly transformed into an impossible journey, leaving patients scrambling for expensive alternatives, delaying treatments, or in some cases simply going without, which turned a political act into a matter of life and death for ordinary families. At the same time, students enrolled in cross-border educational programs, high schoolers who attended classes in sister cities, university students involved in binational research projects, children in bilingual immersion schools, were abruptly forced into suspension, their semesters shattered, their collaborations halted, their dreams of continuity placed on indefinite hold. And these disruptions made it clear in a way statistics never could that the border was not merely a geopolitical marker on a map, but a living, breathing web of interdependencies that reached deep into health, education, and the daily survival of countless people who had long relied on its permeability. The international perception of the shutdown also carried extraordinary weight, because while local communities were reeling, global observers were watching carefully, and other nations, particularly close trade partners and allies, interpreted the closure as alarming evidence that the U.S. could, at any moment and without advance warning, disrupt the flow of global commerce, shaking faith in the predictability that underpins international markets. Indeed, the border between the United States and Mexico is not just bilateral in its function. It is an artery through which goods destined for Asia, Europe, and far beyond travel, with components manufactured in Mexico, becoming integral parts of products assembled in U.S. factories and then exported worldwide. And so when the shutdown occurred, its ripples traveled outward with shocking speed, reaching factories in Germany, Japan, and Canada that suddenly found themselves without essential parts, forcing costly delays and even temporary shutdowns of their own. And in this way, a terrifying incident in one region cascaded into a global disturbance, a tremor whose reach underscored how interconnected modern economies had become, The scale of the paralysis was staggering, visible not only in numbers but in lived experiences, as long-haul truck drivers were forced to park for days, watching helplessly while perishable goods spoiled in their trailers and contracts disintegrated. While manufacturing hubs in Mexico, especially in the automotive sector, with its vast networks of plants producing engines, wiring systems, and electronics, suffered immediate, brutal losses, with assembly lines going silent. Workers sent home without pay, and suppliers unable to deliver. U.S. farmers, too, felt the crushing weight, particularly those dependent on seasonal labor from Mexico who suddenly could not bring in the very hands needed to harvest crops, while others faced their own crisis as Mexican agricultural exports failed to reach northern markets, causing shortages and sudden spikes in grocery store prices for staples consumers normally took for granted. Retailers near the border, whose livelihoods depended on the constant churn of cross-border shoppers, saw their revenues collapse almost overnight, as entire shopping districts once filled with energy and commerce emptied into silence. Every passing hour translated into millions of dollars lost, and every day compounded long-term damage that would not be repaired easily. Amid this chaos, the shutdown ignited urgent new conversations about resilience and preparedness, with analysts in both countries suddenly forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that border systems needed fortification not only against violence, trafficking, or illegal crossings, but against the simple yet devastating possibility of disruption itself. The terrifying incident had exposed that without widespread destruction or physical damage, merely halting the flow at ports of entry could paralyze entire economies, and experts floated ideas about diversifying trade routes, investing in domestic supply chains, and creating emergency protocols for border communities. Yet the very fact that such conversations became necessary highlighted just how deeply dependent both nations had grown on the seamless functioning of that line, and how vulnerable they were to its stoppage. For ordinary citizens, the shutdown was not an abstraction but a lived ordeal of frustration and helplessness, with thousands stranded in endless lines at checkpoints, describing a surreal sense of being trapped in limbo as though the ordinary rules of life had been suspended. Some abandoning their cars and seeking shelter nearby, others waiting for hours or days with children crying in the back seat, food and water running out, hopes of passage dwindling. Truck drivers, stuck for so long on highways that became immobile parking lots, formed makeshift communities, pooling supplies, sharing stories, offering solidarity as the wait dragged on, while border towns became tense, half-empty spaces of eerie anticipation, with shops shuttered, schools quiet, streets filled with uneasy silence, and the emotional toll mounting with every hour of uncertainty. Families who had planned reunions for birthdays, weddings, or even funerals were suddenly torn apart, unable to cross, their absence leaving voids that no explanation could fill. Migrant shelters, which had long operated on fragile systems of transport and coordination, found themselves overwhelmed and unable to manage the surges of need. For those already living in precarious circumstances, the shutdown amplified desperation, spotlighting the fragility of lives lived at the mercy of policies on both sides, and while officials emphasized the necessity of security, the human reality was one of despair, confusion, and grief. Culturally, the shutdown left a deep scar on how the border was perceived in the collective imagination, for where once it had been viewed, despite tensions, as a space of movement, exchange, and possibility, it now carried the memory of sudden vulnerability. A place where continuity could be interrupted with brutal finality, and artists, writers, and community leaders captured this shift, with murals that once celebrated unity across the line now read through a bittersweet lens, local radio broadcasting stories of resilience but also of trauma, and the event entering cultural memory not as a fleeting footnote but as a defining rupture that reshaped the very narrative of border life. The legal dimensions compounded the complexity as constitutional. Scholars debated the scope of executive power in shuttering such a vital artery of commerce and mobility. Civil rights groups raised alarms about the treatment of those stranded, arguing that abrupt closure infringed on fundamental rights. And lawsuits emerged, some symbolic in the immediacy of the crisis, but all reflecting deeper anxieties about the balance between security and liberty, about how far governments might go in the name of protection. Within intelligence circles, the shutdown became a case study dissected in detail, with agencies examining every stage of the threat, the flow of information through bureaucracies, the coordination, or lack thereof, between agencies, and simulations being run to test how future scenarios might unfold, while think tanks churned out papers questioning whether even the most advanced technological tools, from surveillance towers to facial recognition to AI-driven monitoring, could withstand the unpredictable chaos of such incidents. The event became not just a crisis but a blueprint, a call for reform or at least re-examination of assumptions long taken for granted. Diplomatically, the effect spread beyond Mexico, straining U.S. relations with multiple allies who depended on stable North American trade, with international chambers of commerce sounding alarms that unpredictability at the U.S. Mexico border could deter investment and destabilize global markets, and in this sense the terrifying incident had internationalized the border, turning what was once framed as a bilateral matter into a global concern. Media coverage added another layer, saturating television screens and front pages with images of abandoned highways, tense patrols, shuttered checkpoints, and interviews with stranded families, while framing varied sharply. Some outlets portraying the security forces as heroes who protected the nation, others focusing on the devastation wrought upon civilians and industries. Yet in either case, the scale of coverage made the shutdown impossible to ignore, transforming it into a national and global spectacle. While social media amplified both truth and rumor at dizzying speed, with hashtags trending worldwide, personal testimonies mixing with misinformation, wild speculation clashing with urgent cries for help, and yet also serving as a lifeline for those stranded, connecting families, organizing mutual aid, and giving journalists raw, unfiltered perspectives from the ground. The educational sector, too, reeled from the disruption, with universities near the borders seeing their international student populations thrown into disarray, research collaborations severed, conferences cancelled, and a new awareness dawning that even the pursuit of knowledge was not immune to the volatility of geopolitics. Agriculture felt its own acute strain, as northbound exports of fresh produce rotted in stalled trucks, U.S. consumers faced shortages, and farmers on both sides saw their livelihoods imperiled by immobility, exposing how fragile the global food chain could be when something as simple as a checkpoint barrier became impossible. Religious communities likewise bore deep losses, as churches and temples that had long united congregants from both nations suddenly found their pews divided by geography, shared rituals cancelled, spiritual bonds tested, and faith leaders forced to minister to fractured flocks. And the psychological legacy lingered long after barricades lifted, embedding a new mindset of contingency in border communities, with families planning for alternative communication in case of future closures, businesses mapping backup supply routes, schools preparing for remote instruction, all acknowledging that the border once assumed permanent in its openness could close at any moment, with consequences too vast to dismiss. And in the long view, the shutdown was not simply a momentary suspension of traffic and trade, but a disruptive shock that peeled back the layers of modern life, exposing just how profoundly entangled the fates of communities, industries, and governments had become, and how fragile those bonds were when tested by crisis, leaving behind not only economic losses and legal debates but also cultural scars, psychological shifts, and a lasting recognition that the line dividing two nations was not just a border, but the hinge upon which entire worlds turned, and whose sudden closing would be remembered as a defining event in the shared history of both peoples.